My name's Kevin Aguanno. I've been in the Agile community forever, since long before we even called this stuff Agile, way back in the late 80s and early 90s. I've been teaching and using these concepts across many different industries in many different contexts. I've worked in IT, I've worked in engineering construction projects, and I've applied Agile in those contexts. I've worked in high-tech manufacturing, business process change, business transformations, mergers and acquisitions, marketing campaign development and management, etc. And I've used Agile throughout all these various types of projects. I've worked as a consultant in the Agile industry for many, many years and worked with government, private sector, and nonprofit organizations. So I've got a good, rich range of experiences that I can share and give you lots of examples of how Agile works in practice in the real world. And one of the big questions people often ask is around contracting. How do I create a contract for an Agile project? Agile, if you're aware, is it's intended for high change environments where the scope of the project is constantly shifting and evolving. You often don't get high budget change, right? Your project is 300K, no 500K, no 200K, no back to 300K. Your budget doesn't flip around like crazy, and neither usually does your timelines. Your main deadline usually stays in place. They may shorten it a bit or extend it a bit once or twice, but it's usually not flip-flopping around like crazy. But we do get tons of change in scope on certain kinds of projects. These are the projects where people say, I'll know what I want when I see it, or we got a rapidly approaching deadline. Let's get started on the stuff we know, we understand, while we're still trying to sort out the rest, right? These kinds of projects are problematic, right? In that we can't clearly define the scope up front. And that creates a challenge for contracting, right? So how do you sign a contract, maybe with a fixed budget and a fixed timeline, when the scope is still evolving? So I've got a few slides that I've put together to try and walk you through some of these concepts. I'm assuming everybody can see my screen, so I'm just going to proceed on. So let's talk about contracts overall, right? If you look at contracts sort of philosophically, there's really two main categories of contracts, two main types. One is what we call a fixed price contract. Fixed price means I'm going to, so we'll take two relationships. There's the supplier and the buyer. The buyer asks the supplier for a price, a timeline often, and a price, and says, I'm going to hold you to it. And you're going to have to stick within whatever price. I'm not going to pay you a penny more. You're going to get exactly that amount of money if you do the work. So that's a fixed price arrangement. And then at the opposite end of the spectrum, you're going to see time and materials or cost plus contracts or cost reimbursed contracts, where I'm going to pay you perhaps an hourly rate for every hour that you work. I'll cover all your expenses. I'll pay your hourly fees. I will cover your costs plus a bit of margin for profit. So maybe we agree on an hourly rate. I'm going to hire you at X number of dollars per hour, and you're going to do whatever work I tell you to. I'm going to steer the direction. I'm going to be guiding you, telling you what activities I want you to work on, and you're going to work on those activities, and you'll get paid for however many hours you work. If you work 1 hour, if you work 1,000 hours, you're going to get paid for those hours because that's the arrangement that we have. So those are two extremes. One is an hourly based fee, and there's no real end. It could be 1 hour, it could be an infinite number of hours. And the other one is a fixed amount of money for a fixed piece of work. And there's hybrids and things like that in the middle, but those are the sort of the two extremes of how you can look at contracts. I'm going to spend a little bit of time looking at those through different lenses. So from a risk perspective, to do a fixed price contract, it typically means that I'm going to, as the buyer, I'm going to transfer all the risk to my supplier. The supplier or the vendor of services takes on all of the risk. I'm going to say, I'm going to ask you for a number, and I'm going to hold you to it. And if the number's too low, too bad, so sad, you should have given me a higher number. Tough on you. And that's the problem. We've transferred all the risk to the supplier. Now that draws or drives certain behaviors among that supplier. If I'm transferring all the risk to the supplier, we're creating a very contentious relationship. It's a very low trust environment. I'm going to hold you to it, and I don't trust that you're going to act in my interest, so I'm going to stick to this fixed number. It doesn't matter what happens. Shame on you if you make a mistake. In the face of change to this, it creates a confrontational relationship. If I say, hey, I know I said I wanted red, I changed my mind, I want green, the supplier is going to come back with aha, see, that's a change request. Here's a form to sign. I'm going to charge you extra money now. They're going to do what they can to protect their profit, to protect their margins. So when there's a change or something that could even be interpreted as a change, it often creates conflict. This comes about when you hear things like, well, that's what I said, but not what I meant, or this is what I've always been trying to tell you, you just don't understand, right? So the client says, oh, I wanted that to be green, and they say, but you didn't tell me it needed to be any color, so we chose the cheaper color. It's like, I don't care, I've always meant green. Why would it not be green? That's our corporate standards. We always do green. Everything else is green. Why wouldn't that one be green too? So there's these sort of unstated requirements that sometimes create conflict. You often hear somebody, there's a lot of conflict around unclear or fuzzy requirements. That creates a lot of conflict as well. So a very confrontational relationship in the face of change, very much a legalistic relationship, as if you were working through lawyers or procurement departments, and you're not working directly between the supplier and the buyer. There's these intermediaries managing the relationship. And if I'm the vendor of services and I'm going to be asked to provide you with a quote and to stick to it, right? You're going to hold me to it, then I'm going to want tons of detail up front to help me understand my risk and to manage my risk. So I'm going to want lots of upfront detailed requirements. I'm going to spend lots of time upfront analyzing and thinking this through to make sure that the number I give you includes contingencies to handle the known identifiable risks, the things that I can foresee going wrong. I'm going to build in plans to deal with that should it go wrong. So I'm going to build in cost and schedule contingencies to deal with these identifiable risks. And then probably a little bit extra contingency for the unknown risks, the things that could jump out of nowhere and surprise me that I never expected. Sometimes we talk about Murphy's Law. If something can go wrong, it probably will. There's always going to be something that surprises you on a project. So this extra contingency is put aside to deal with that stuff as well. So we've added in tons and tons of risk contingencies, typically into these fixed prices. Let's move to the other side and look at time and materials. So if I'm the buyer and you're the supplier of services, and I'm just going to pay you by the hour, I'm taking on all the risk of there being cost or schedule overruns. If you take 1 hour to do the work or it takes you 5 hours to do the work, I'm just going to have to pay more if it takes you longer. You're still getting covered either way. So I take on the risk of cost overruns, but I also need to trust you more because I'm not getting a fixed number from you. I have to trust that you're going to be working diligently, that you're going to be working in a more focused manner, that you've got my best interests at heart. So it requires a lot of trust as well to work in a time and materials environment. Now, if I'm just paying you by the hour, you could start the project with no detail. We could just say, hey, come on over to my place. I'm going to pay you, $30 an hour to help me fix up my basement. And you show up and you say, sure, I'll give you a hand. And the clock starts ticking as soon as I open the front door and let you in. Now, you have no idea what you're going to be doing. It could be moving garbage out of the way. It could be painting. You could be helping me tear down a wall. You could be helping me move furniture. You don't care. If you're there for an hour, you're there for 5 hours, you're getting paid by the hour. So the more hours, the better. So we could start with very little detail, very fuzzy requirements, and we'll just figure it out as we go. So if you're working in a relationship where clients really aren't sure what they want yet, and you need to help them define the requirements and define the scope, then time and material sometimes is best because it gives us that flexibility to go wherever this trail takes us. So fixed price, we want all the details up front. Time and materials, we can start with very few details up front. Fixed price, we have high need for, high risk for the vendor. Time materials, no risk for the vendor or very little risk for the vendor. Instead, the risk shifts to the buyer. And as we talked about the trust relationship, we tend to use the fixed price approach when we have low trust with the buyer, between the buyer and the vendor. And we use time materials where there tends to be a good close working relationship and that we've established some trust between the buyer and the vendor or the service provider. In the face of change, when there's a fixed price contract, there is a lot of conflict between the buyer and the vendor. But on a time and materials contract, it tends to be very, very open and cooperative and collaborative. So if I'm providing services to you and you're the buyer, and I was supposed to build you a garden shed, and partway through you say, you know what, I want you to build 2 garden sheds. It's like, okay, great. I'm not arguing. There's no conflict. It's like, it'll cost a bit more. It'll take more hours. You got to pay for more materials. And you're like, yeah, okay, let's go. I'm all for it, right? There tends to be more collaboration when there's change as opposed to fixed price where we put up all these barriers. Aha, that's a change request. Here's a document. We're going to stop work until you sign this. And it can cause lots of costs and disruption and pain in the relationship. So these two contract models are almost polar opposites to each other. Now, what kind of methodology do you think best aligns with fixed price contracts? Projects where we want tons of detail up front so that the vendor can come up with a number and a plan that we're going to hold them to. So these projects are characterized by tons of time up front, gathering requirements, doing design, estimating and planning, coming up with the plan so we know exactly how much this project costs. We're going to hold people to it. We're going to have a very confrontational, legalistic relationship in the face of change. That sounds like a waterfall project to me, right? Waterfall is best aligned with fixed price contracts. Let's look at the other side, right? We have these flexible contracts with fuzzy scope. The client is accepting all the risk, but they're in charge. They get to change their mind and change the requirements and steer the ship, right? As their needs change, they can navigate the project in that direction. Very collaborative in the face of change. We can start with fuzzy requirements, and we tend to have a trusting, collaborative relationship. Well, that's kind of how Agile works. So the natural contracting model for Agile is time and materials, and the natural contracting model for waterfall is fixed price. Now, sometimes we got to break those natural models, right? So sometimes we want time and materials contracts for a waterfall project or a fixed price Agile contract. Anytime you cross directions like that, that's what lawyers and contract specialists call a dysfunctional contracting model. The risk, the assignment of risk and responsibilities doesn't align with the power and control. So let's look at the first one, time and materials on a waterfall project. So often in a waterfall project, we may see them come up as time and materials contracts. We'll pay you by the hour. Here's where things don't work out so well. With waterfall, you want tons of information up front so you can build the plan, the perfect plan, and then you try and stick to the plan. But if I'm paying you time and materials, you've built into that plan contingencies for in case risks occur, right? Now, if those risks don't occur and and we can come in ahead of schedule or under budget, I'm going to pay you less as a vendor. So it's almost like you're penalized for doing a good job. And then if things go really wrong and say all of the risks occur and things get really messy and it goes over budget, time materials, theoretically, I should be paying you that extra money. However, what typically happens in the real world is the client comes down hard on the vendor and says, what do you mean you need more money? You came up with a plan. You came up with a price. We said that price was okay. We approved it. Yes, it's a time materials contract, but I thought we hired good vendors who knew what they were doing. I thought you guys were professionals. You should know, shame on you. You should have known better. Yes, this extra thing came about, but you should have been able to predict that. We've never done that before. You've done this project 100 times before with other clients. We were relying on your expertise, and you get in this huge conflict. So in the interests of avoiding a lawsuit or customer satisfaction, often what happens is the vendor eats the overage. So they end up absorbing any over budget costs, even though it's time materials and legally they probably could have charged more, they don't. And they end up treating time and materials contracts as a very broken model called time and materials with a cap, or time and materials with a not to exceed amount. So in other words, if you take less time, the client wins because they don't pay as much. And if the project goes over budget, you don't pay the client doesn't pay the over budget because there's a cap, so the client wins again. The client always wins, the vendor always loses. That's a dysfunctional contracting model. Time and materials with a cap or a not to exceed amount, or just a time and materials waterfall project, which tends to get treated as if it were time and materials with a cap due to fear of lawsuits or client relationship management concerns. It also gets dysfunctional when we try to do agile fixed price contracts, although there is a workaround I'll talk about in a moment. Agile, is flexible. We start with very fuzzy scope. We get started quickly working on the stuff we know while we're still sorting out the rest. So there is no perfect idea of what we're doing. In fact, many Agile teams, you ask them, how long is the project going to take? They're going to say, I don't know, we'll see. We'll figure it out. You tell me when we're done. We'll just keep doing stuff in order of business value. And when you think it's enough, you tell us to stop. If we stop early, you save money. If you want more stuff, we'll take a bit longer, but the client is in charge. So if the client is in charge, the vendor, the buyer of services is in charge and making all the decisions and steering the project, that's unfair on a fixed price contract. Because in fixed price, the vendor takes all the risk of overages, yet the client is defining the scope as they go, and the client could define a scope that's much bigger than the vendor priced in. The client could steer the project in a risky way that the vendor's not prepared to deliver. So again, who's got the control is mismatched with who's got the responsibility or accountability. So that's another dysfunctional contract model, is an agile fixed price project, because it puts the vendor at tremendous risk, right, under the client's control. The vendor has no way of controlling that risk. So what do we do about this? How do we resolve this problem of these dysfunctional crisscross contracts, waterfall time and materials or agile fixed price? Well, there's a best practice out there that creates kind of a hybrid contract model called the mandatory and variable scope contract, or sometimes called the fixed and optional, or fixed and variable scope contract. And what it is, it's kind of a hybrid between these two. We would break the project up into two phases, because on any project, there's going to be some must-haves. There's going to be scope that you know for sure you need, right? The known knowns. I know for sure I need this stuff. There's no point in starting this project without it. So say we're building a school. Well, I'm going to need a front office. I'm going to need a gymnasium. I'm going to need classrooms and washrooms. There's certain things you know for sure you're going to have to put in place. Then there's stuff you probably should have, but is optional. Like we should have a music room. We should have an art room if it's a junior school, right? You should have these things. And then there's some stuff that's completely optional, like variable scope. Optional scope is like, we may or may not have a swimming pool in my school, as an example, right? So some schools have them, but it's not common. So it's an option that we could consider. So there's must-haves, should-haves, and let's call them nice-to-haves, right? So there's these three ranges of things. What you're going to find is when you're in a high change environment, as we are with Agile projects. The change mostly happens to the things that have some uncertainty around them, the things that we should do, the should haves or the nice to haves, things that aren't for sure are the ones that tend to have the most change. The stuff I know I need, we usually have a crisper view of that, right? You usually have a very clear understanding of the must-haves. It's the should-haves and nice-to-haves that tend to be very fuzzy and variable. So what we do is we break the project up into two phases. There's the mandatory scope phase, and then there's the variable scope phase. So we split the project into two. The must-haves are in the mandatory phase. The variable scope phase has the should-haves and the nice-to-haves. So we split our scope amongst those two phases as well. Now, that mandatory phase, because for sure, we're going to do those mandatory things, because by definition, they're mandatory. If for sure we're going to do them, then there's no great risk of waste in us spending the time up front analyzing those must-haves in all of their glory. Let's get all the detail out on the table. Let's really understand them intimately. Once we understand those features, those deliverables, those requirements in true detail, down to the nth degree, once we fully understand them, then I can estimate the work required with some confidence. And I can build in the appropriate contingencies because I can do a proper risk assessment and risk analysis, and I can come up with a fixed price contract for the first phase. So we're trying to have a fixed price for the entire project. That first phase, pretty straightforward. It's business as usual. It's old-fashioned project estimating. Essentially, you're treating it almost like it's a waterfall phase, right? So it's we say this mandatory scope is going to take us 6 months and $600,000, and that's with your built-in contingencies and everything. That's the price and the timeline for that first mandatory scope phase. But this is an Agile project. There's going to be some stuff that's uncertain. Probably not the mandatory stuff. The uncertainty will come with the should-haves and nice-to-haves. So after we complete phase one, then we look at phase two. Phase two, we divide it up into iterations, into sprints, waves, phases. In Agile, they call them iterations. And maybe we have 6 one-month iterations, right? So we have 6 one-month cycles of time in which we're going to get some of this variable scope done. So we have the mandatory phase, which is a waterfall that takes 6 months, and then we have 6 one-month mini waterfalls following that to deal with the variable scope phase. So my total project then is 6 plus 6 one-month iterations. That's a 12-month project. I've got a fixed timeline. And then I estimate my variable scope items. We put them on a list, which in Agile we call the project backlog. We put them on a list and we estimate their size and complexity, most often using a technique called story point estimating. It actually looks at the complexity of these features. But what we're able to do with these points of complexity is start to understand the big ones, the small ones, the medium-sized ones. We're able to group them and scale them and understand how we're doing. So we have this list of maybe 200 items. We're not going to fit all 200 items in this project. That backlog gets prioritized into the should-haves and then the nice-to-haves. And we arbitrarily choose a line that we think is feasible or achievable. We're going to get all of the should-haves done and a certain number of the nice-to-haves. I will put in a buffer that will cover a significant amount of scope, usually all the should-haves and a few of the nice-to-haves, so we can have some extras in the project. Now, how do I estimate that? Well, this story point estimating approach allows us to assign a number of points to each feature. This feature is easy, it's 1 point. This feature is big, it's 37 points, right? We're able to scale them so we get an understanding of the big, huge ones, the little ones, the medium ones, and we can start to understand the differences. Then we go through a process where we understand the team's capacity for work. Now, there's math involved. It involves old-fashioned estimating on small samples, not even random samples, but carefully selected samples of items off that backlog, off that variable backlog. we take a handful of items, we analyze them in detail so we can understand how much time they're going to take, and then we can come up with an estimate that will tell me how many points worth of work can my team do in an iteration. So we said they're 1 month iterations. Say my team is 6 people, so we can say how many points worth of work on average can my 6 people get done in an average iteration. So as I said, it's a little bit more sophisticated than we have time to talk about here. It takes a couple hours to discuss all these estimating techniques, but suffice to say that we're able to understand the team's capacity. So 6 people in a 1 month iteration, on average, this group will be able to do approximately, say, 50 points worth of work in a month. So then we start to divide up or assign features to those deliverables, those variable scope features, assign them to iterations in the variable scope phase. So obviously, in order of priority, we'll start assigning all the should haves. Those ones get assigned first to iterations. Each iteration should not exceed about 50 points. And then when we're done all the should haves and there's room left over, start assigning a couple nice to haves, and that would kind of be the scope. But remember, this is a high change project. We're using Agile because this is a high change project. So which items are in which iteration, or whether they're even on the list at all, may change. That's okay. We're just trying to set an expectation. So if I say I can do about 50 points per iteration, let's add some contingency again, and let's, there's some risk in here, right? Because there's change happening. So let's add another 20%. So let's make this 50 points, 60. I've added 20% contingency. So I'm going to say I can do 60 points. 60 points. No, I've done that. Sorry, I did that wrong. We're going to have 50 points per iteration times 6 iterations. Maybe we're expecting 40 points. I added some contingency to get myself up to 50, and I got 50 points per iteration times 6 iterations. So there's a total of, say, 300 points. So what does my contract say? My contract says this is a fixed price Agile project. That's the goal. It's fixed price. It's going to cost me and take 1 year and $1.2 million. So how did I come up with that? The project is divided into 2 phases. Phase 1, the mandatory scope phase, is 6 months and $600,000. Phase 2, the variable scope phase, is divided into 6 1-month iterations, each totaling approximately 50 points worth of work each, which equals approximately $100,000 each. So 6 times $100,000. The variable scope phase is $600,000. So that's how I get 1 year, $1.2 million. Now, the contract says, as we start the project, we're going to do the mandatory scope phase first. We're going to create all of the mandatory scope items. At the end of that mandatory scope phase, which is 6 months and $600,000, we're going to ask for sign-off on the mandatory stuff. So the client's going to review it all and say, yes, the mandatory items have been dealt with to my satisfaction. They sign off. That will trigger the start of the variable scope phase. The variable scope phase is broken up into 6 1-month iterations. And what we're going to do is at the start of each variable scope phase, I'm going to ask the client to sign a work authorization or a work order. These work orders will say the name of the phase, or which iteration this is, and which specific features the client wants us to work on for that iteration. Beside each feature will be how many points it is, and that list should not exceed approximately 50 points, which is approximately $100,000 worth of work. So on average, each of these iterations, these work orders, should total about 50 points or $100,000 worth of work. Now, in the contract, it says, client, to help you, here's a list of all of the variable scope items you've identified so far, and next to them is how many points we say each one of those is. You can choose anything off that list to fill your work order up to 50 points worth of work. We don't care which ones, have fun. Do it however you want. However, there may be some dependencies between these items that you need to respect. If you come up with new items, because this is a high change project, if you identify new items that you want during the project, hey, no problem at any time. I'd be happy to add it to the list and tell you how many points it's going to be. Is that scope creep? No, because nothing in that list is actually in scope until it shows up on a signed authorized work order at the start of an iteration or a sprint. So these work orders are essentially like change requests, change requesting in scope, adding scope, specific scope into my responsibilities, one iteration at a time. So we're going to go through the project. You're going to be signed after the mandatory phase. We start the variable phase. You sign a work order at the beginning of each 1 month period of time. Tell me which items specifically you want me to work on. Out of the list of available items, you want new items, come up with them. I'll just put them on the list and tell how many points it is. The project is over when we've completed the mandatory scope phase and either 6 1 month work orders, 6 work orders worth of work, or you've stopped signing work orders partway through. So maybe we've did 3 work orders and you said that's good enough, I'm going to end the project early. You just stop signing work orders, the project ends and you only pay for the part that you used. If you want to extend the project, sign a 7th work order and we'll add another 1 month iteration on the end. So we can continue extending the project just by signing more work orders at the end as well. This does a couple interesting things. It gives the client a guarantee of a specific quantity of work. All of your must-haves will be covered, plus 300 points worth of other stuff, right? 6 times 50. That's a significant amount of work, right? You get a lot of work. Probably all your should-haves and a few of the nice-to-haves as well. We've given you a guarantee of a substantial volume of work, but we haven't locked you into which variable scope items you want. You can pick and choose and change your mind, add new items along the way, reprioritize, deprioritize. That's cool. We're going to do 300 points worth of work. So it gives the client a guarantee of a fixed price, a fixed timeline, and a substantial volume of work, along with the control that they're desperately looking for, the ability to steer this cruise ship, to change directions as the business needs change. So the client gets to kind of have their cake and eat it too, right? They get all the control and they get to get a fixed price on it as well. So all good stuff from the client's perspective. What about the poor vendor, the supplier? What's it get for them? Well, they got the work, guarantee that they're going to get the job, right? They got the contract, so they got a guarantee of some work. During the mandatory phase, they did detailed, old-fashioned, upfront, in-depth analysis. So they've thoroughly understood the requirements. They've analyzed all the requirements, figured out exactly what they need, put in their risk contingencies to make sure they're protected in case stuff goes wrong. So they've got the safety of all those contingencies protecting them, the vendor, on that mandatory phase. Then during the Agile phase, they're also still protected because their estimating approach, the Agile story point estimating or complexity point estimating, builds in contingencies to individual features as well. So there's contingencies built into the points number. So maybe a particular feature was estimated at 5 points, but it had some risk in it, so we upped it to 6 points to add some contingency, 20% contingency for that particular feature. So there's contingencies built into the points estimates as well to protect the vendor. And there may be hidden contingencies around schedule as well. For example, in this case, I've done this once on a project. I built 6 months times 50 points for the variable scope phase, so 300 points. But the real answer was I think I could get it done in 5 months, not 6, because I think my team's productivity, called velocity in Agile, but I think their productivity is going to be about 60 points per iteration. So I can complete that 300 points in 1 less month. But to be more conservative. I wanted to add on that extra month of buffer on the schedule. The problem is, I know my client. If they saw a month of buffer on the schedule, they're going to expect me to be done a month early, and I'm not going to get to use that buffer, right? It's there because I think I need it, but because it's visible, the client's going to micromanage that and try to not use it. So what's end up going to happen is we're going to be challenged on this project because we won't get to use the schedule contingency that we think we need. So instead of committing to 60 points per iteration times 5 iterations, I'm going to spread those points out across the 6 iterations. I'm going to spread the work out to kind of hide that there was an empty iteration. So instead of 60 points times 5 iterations, I'm going to do 50 points times 6 iterations. Still adds to 300 points in 6 months, but it allows me now to have extra built-in buffer capacity hidden inside each one of those iterations. I probably am going to hit around 60, so it looks like I might be done early unless things slip, in which case I will use that buffer, but it's within the plan, so the client, and it's not labeled as buffer, so the client will be delighted. If I'm a little bit ahead because I'm working closer to 60, that's good news to the client, but I still protect my buffer. So the vendor is protected as well because they have detailed contingencies and risk management built into the mandatory phase, and they've put in these cost and schedule contingencies to deal with specific risks during the variable scope phase. Even if the client asks for new features, you get to add contingencies built into the point estimate when you estimate the complexity of those points. So the vendor is able to protect themselves on the variable scope phase as well. So the vendor gets the work and they're protected and through both phases. The client, gets to have their cake and eat it too. They get a substantial volume of scope and a fixed price. Everybody kind of wins. And that is currently the best practice on Agile projects. Now, I've got another example I'm going to show you from another project, let's say another example. This is a time and materials contract for an Agile project. And sometimes people have been asking me, like, how do you do this? How do you make this work? So I'm going to show you one from a real project that was done. Oops, let me find my file here. A real project that was done for the provincial government in Ontario. So I'm going to show you a sample of what those things can look like. Now, obviously, every contract is different, and this is just one example. It's not the only example. It's not even necessarily the best example, but it gives you an example of how this could come about. So this contract has 2 parts to it. So I'm just opening those 2 plans now so I can refer to them. And let's give my computer a moment to open these documents, and I'm going to show them to you as we go through. So the contract is broken into 2 pieces. I'm going to reshare this document now so you can see it. Let me just expand it, and we'll share my screen again. So this contract model is broken into 2 pieces. Before I get too far into it, let me sort of explain the scenario behind this. In this particular case, this was an IT project. I was working for IBM at the time. The provincial government asked vendors to bid on expanding a piece of software that was created for them by another vendor who had since gone out of business. So another vendor had created this software system. The government was using it quite effectively, and then the other vendor went out of business and disappeared. The government's still using this software for a couple more years, and then they want to add stuff to it. Unfortunately, they had no documentation about how it worked internally, so there was a lot of uncertainty about what would or could, how that could be done. So when they issued a request for proposals, an RFP, it was very high level, vague and fuzzy. They were specific about this is the cool stuff we want to add to the software, but they could tell you almost nothing about the existing software. They even went on to say there is very little, if any, documentation. We don't have source code, and we want you to modify the software. So as you can imagine, almost all the vendors no bid. right? They didn't know what to do on this. It just sounded too risky, and there were no bids except for mine, except for IBM. I came in and I bid on this because I used an Agile time and materials contract. I knew there would be high levels of change because there's so much uncertainty around this project, and the client didn't have a lot of details. So I expected plenty of change. So what I did was I broke the project down. I gave them a budget. What I said was, I think this project is going to take approximately X number of dollars based on my expert opinion. That's not contractually binding. We're not committing to that number because it depends on what you want to do, but we're giving you a number for planning purposes that we think is in the right range. It's a reasonable amount. It gives you some planning numbers you can use to see if this is even worth doing from a budgetary perspective. Now, we can't give you a specific bid because we don't know enough details yet. You weren't able to provide any details about the existing software application. So what we're going to do is we're going to do an exploratory approach. What we're going to suggest is break the project up into iterations, and you're going to sign a work order at the start of each iteration, just like what we talked about before. And each work order is going to detail the work and the cost for that iteration and the specific deliverables for that iteration. At the end of each work order, if you're happy with the progress, you sign the next work order. We keep going. We expect the total that we've given you is enough, but we will commit one work order at a time. So let's take a look at this contract now and get a feel for it. All right. So this is a statement of work under an existing master services agreement that has all the legal mumbo jumbo about liability and stuff like that. So both organizations sign the agreement. There's a high-level scope description. The sysadmin web portal will allow system administrators to blah, blah, blah. Here's the overall objectives of the project. Here's our responsibilities. We're going to assist you in defining and prioritizing the functional and non-functional requirements because the client couldn't even clearly define them in a way that we needed to. We're going to provide software development services, including designing and coding and testing. We're going to assist you periodically to review the work completed to date and capture feedback. This is in Agile. We have these end of iteration demos. We're going to manage it as an iterative and incremental software development project using the Scrum methodology. And now here's where we get into the meat of it. At the start of this, the next bullet here. At the start of each iteration and at the start of the project, we're going to analyze it and give you a rough idea of our effort estimates for each item. This is my points estimate for each, the story points estimate for each requirement. At the beginning of the project, the estimates will only be approximations used to prepare the overall schedule. The revised estimates at the start of each iteration will provide detailed estimates of the work for the upcoming iteration and will form the commitments. So in other words, what I give you up front is just a guess. The detailed commitment will happen just in time. And we're going to give you the following deliverables, right? A project plan that tells you roughly how many iterations long the project is and the approximate budget. A detailed iteration plan for your approval before each iteration begins that includes the specific requirements to be completed, the resources required, the duration, the cost, etc. This is what PMI calls rolling wave planning. You have the high-level project schedule, but you do the detailed schedules just in time, one iteration at a time, just as they're needed. You're going to have to sign those iteration plans to authorize us to begin doing the work in the plan. That forms a commitment. We're going to give you a project backlog spreadsheet that shows the list of all the outstanding requirements and how many points each is, right? It'll be updated at the end of each iteration to include new requirements, changed requirements, deleted requirements. We're going to give you something called a sprint burn down chart, which is an Agile forecasting tool. We're going to update it every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday to tell you the effort consumed to date in the iteration and the hours required to complete the iteration. We'll give you a budget tracking spreadsheet, some software, some design docs, some test cases. That sort of gives you the scope of the project. Your responsibilities, provide us the latest information you have, give us access to the systems and your people, test this stuff as we go. Okay. The project will occur between these dates. We're going to divide the schedule into iterations, each of approximately 2 weeks in length. The initial project plan will provide the approximate number of iterations. However, the signed iteration plans will authorize our team members to work for the duration of each iteration. And if an iteration plan is signed by your sponsor that extend the end date, then the signed iteration plan will create a new end date. The project's done when the end date is reached, or if we've completed the authorized iteration plans and no future ones are forthcoming. Here's our estimated charges. We're going to charge you based on the signed iteration plans, but here's some estimated, here's the hourly rates we're agreeing on, the estimated hours, and the estimated charges. It's a time and materials contract. You pay for what was actually used. We'll invoice you at the end of each iteration. And that's it. That's the main contract. The next piece you want to look at is the, oops, did I close that down prematurely? I did. Well, the next piece we want to look at is the iteration plans themselves. So the iteration plans is, I said, essentially your change request form that change requests in some scope. So let me show you what an iteration plan could look like to give you a sense of the what actually is coming into scope as part of this project. So remember that these are like the work, I've called these work orders, right? You're signing these to authorize work to come in. So let me open one up. Here it is. Why is this not responding? Here it goes. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. Here's a typical iteration plan. So this is again, the thing that we sign at the start of each iteration. Name of the project, who the project manager, who the sponsor is, what iteration this is for. This is iteration 1, high priority. What's the goal for this iteration? What's the high level goal? So we added some information about the scope of the iteration start and end date. Then we have detailed description of requirements and the acceptance criteria. So we've also decided when we got the requirements, how are you going to determine if it's good enough, or how are you going to determine if it's done? And got agreement from the sponsor on what those things are, because that'll speed up the project later so there's fewer surprises. What's the commitment required? Well, you know, we need access to these stakeholders to dig deeper into the event group manager and to provide some GUI interface elements, probably 2 to 3 hours required between days 1 and 3. Also need access to Kathy to verify the audit fields and the security access levels, approximately 3 hours around days 2 to 3. Is this particularly specific? Is it a commitment? I'm using words like approximately and probably. When do you ever see those in a contract, right? But it sets some expectation with the sponsor about how much work, how much interaction we're going to need with the sponsor's team, with the stakeholders, because they're going to have to arrange to have those staff available to work with us approximately in those time frames, so they know if somebody can go off on vacation that week or not, or are they going to have to work with us. And we also provided not only how much resource time we need from their staff, but what about our staff? Here's how many hours we're going to need from each staff member. The hourly rates are already covered in the contract, so if we multiply that out, it's almost $71,000 for this iteration. And we've identified a specific risk unique to this iteration. So by signing off on this plan, the sponsor has signed off that they're aware of this risk. So if this risk materializes and causes us trouble and we need to go a little bit over on this iteration, we have the sponsor's acknowledgement or acceptance of that risk to allow us to do so. And then it just says, by signing below, both parties agree to do the work described above and get paid at the end of the iteration according to this document. So that's essentially how these contract models work. They're complex because these projects are high change projects. We know these projects are going to be high change before we start. That's why we're using an Agile project model. And what we've done is with these time and materials contracts I just showed you, we've eliminated some of the chaos by giving some high level expectation for the business of how that Agile contract can run. And I've also described to you how we can do Agile fixed and variable scope contracts. So a couple different contracting models. We just reviewed the contracts. So at this point, I want to open this up for Q&A, for questions. Have you tried Agile contracts before of any kind? What problems did you experience? Would this stuff help you resolve them? Do you have any questions about what we've discussed? Anybody? Okay. So we were scheduling to run this for 1 hour. We've been at this now for an hour. Well, we started 5 minutes, 10 minutes late, but we've run it now for an hour. So this ends our discussion on Agile contracts, but I will stay on for an extra few minutes if anybody has any specific questions. My name is Kevin Aguanno. You can reach me via my cell phone, 416-540-8570. That's 416-540-8570. If you ever have any questions about anything we've discussed on this session, or you can email me, Aguanno, my last name, Aguanno, Aguanno at procept.com. That's procept.com. Okay, any more questions? Now's your opportunity. You can do a couple things. You can either you can type it into the questions window, or you can just unmute yourself and ask away, ask your question.
Kevin, how popular are these types of contracts?
Sorry, Donna, can you repeat that, please?
How popular are these types of contracts? Like, I would think that owners are probably more gearing towards the traditional lump sum contracts.
Yeah.
And probably don't like the uncertainty that goes along with the Agile type contracts. So just, are they gaining momentum, or like?
Yeah, yeah, sure, thank you. They absolutely are gaining more popularity. You're right. Traditionally, owners or buyers like the fixed price contracts because they can manage their risk of going over budget. But what happens is, say the work is going to cost X dollars. By asking for a fixed price, I'm automatically paying more than X, right? X plus some risk contingencies in case things go wrong, because that vendor has to cover themselves in case everything all goes to heck on the project. And realistically, not everything goes wrong all the time. So probably the vendor is priced in more contingency than we probably needed. So I ended up almost automatically overpaying for the project by doing a fixed price contract. It's a trade-off. It's like I'm guaranteeing a higher price than I needed to pay, but with now the elimination of the risk of me going over budget. That higher number will be guaranteed and locked in stone. And it's a trade-off. In government, because we use the zero-based budgeting model, everybody has to use up all their money by the end of the year. They don't want projects coming in late in the year over budget, because they got nowhere to cover for that. It becomes, they may not have enough contingencies tucked away or slush money tucked away other places of their budget that they can borrow from. So it causes chaos, right? So they'd rather have the guarantee. They'd rather pay more, overpay, but have a guarantee of a number that they can plan on than have the uncertainty of something maybe coming over budget a little bit or going under budget that causes chaos. Government is the worst offender of this, but they are starting to get a little bit more efficient, especially as we're getting more and more adoption of Agile projects within the public sector. In the province of Ontario, we have a whole digital government team whose job it is to drive Agile delivery within the Ontario public sector. And they've been very effective at getting the message out and getting the government to start to open up and look at newer contracting models. That time and materials contract I showed you from an Ontario government project was from back in the, I think it was the early to mid 2000s, like 2004 or 5, somewhere around in there. So these kind of contracting models have been around for a long time and are getting more and more popular. It's easy for procurement people to do fixed price. That's the easiest way for them to do things because it makes life simple, right? Give me the quote. Here's the SKU. Here's the product number. Here's the part I'm looking for. Everybody bid. But with services, it's hard to compare apples and apples because different vendors have different capabilities. Some have higher skill levels than others. They may have different approaches. So even fixed price, it's hard sometimes to choose the winner when you're comparing and you're only looking at price, because their approaches and experience levels may be very different. The time and materials approach allows you to kind of take advantage of some of that. Yes, some vendors might be higher priced per hour, but they're going to get it done in fewer hours because they have way more experienced teams, right? So working with them, you can see their level of collaboration, the level of quality will be different, the ability to borrow from prior work that they've done and have some reuse of deliverables and work products will speed things up and make things more stable. So the time materials allows people to work collaboratively and be a little bit more flexible on how they want to do this. And it allows the sponsor to be in control. The sponsor is steering the project. I've had government clients or even private sector clients who said, nope, not doing time materials, no way, must be a fixed price. And I'll say, great, then before we can proceed, I need all the details. I need all the gory details up front so we know exactly what it is we're bidding on. And they say, but I don't have all the details. Well, then how am I supposed to bid? I don't know if it's a day's work or a week's worth of work. How am I supposed to guess? They said, well, guess high. Okay, so it's going to take 100 years. There you go. There's a high guess. I'm sure I can do it in less than 100 years. And they said, well, that's being ridiculous. And I said, well, asking us to bid on something that nobody understands is probably ridiculous too. So let's get down and talk. Let's roll up our sleeves and do some hard work. You have two choices. Give us all the information up front so we can do that bid, or let's just agree that we're going to try and work together in a common direction. You're in control, and as things emerge, if you want to stop or change directions or kill the project early, you're in complete control. There will be no penalty for early termination, and the deliverables that we're creating along the way, if you want to switch vendors, take the work products that we've delivered, grab them, and go work with another vendor if you want. And that's a way of them staying in control and getting what they need out of it. And more sponsors are taking on those kinds of contracts because they realize the world is complex, things are changing, and they don't understand anything either. Okay, we have a hand up from Sammy. Sammy, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Okay, thanks very much, Kevin. I really enjoyed your presentation, especially the example and the iteration plan. I have one question. How can I apply this model in construction? I'm specialized in construction, so I really like to get a hint on how do you do that, especially in a government environment where
Sure.
you need a total fixed price. I
Sure.
tried that about 25 years ago, where I divided the project into a confirmed scope and a risk stuff. And I asked the contractor to bid on the risk option, or it gives them about 5 risks, and it did not work very well. So I'm looking forward to hear your idea of applying Agile approach to construction projects.
Great, thank you. Well, let's look at this mandatory and variable scope contract. As you said, fixed and risky stuff, right? Let's look at that model. It's just probably the right approach. So let's take an example. Say we're building a mixed-use office condo tower, right, with some retail and restaurants at the bottom level. And this is what we're building. There's some stuff we know we're going to need. We can design this 15-story building. I know I can design out, and I know exactly call it the skeleton of the building and the sheathing of the building. So I can price out pretty accurately the concrete work, the exterior glass cladding and insulation, and the major infrastructure components, even providing some major plumbing and HVAC components, etc. What I don't know yet is the interior fit out of the offices on the 14th floor and 13th floor, those interior, if I'm providing that, I don't know the details yet. Now, sometimes tenants are responsible for their own, but say that you're the owner of the building and you're building it for your own organization. You're not a landlord building it for tenants. Then you're responsible for building that out too. And we don't know how many interior walls, where they are, how many washrooms we're going to need specifically. Things like that may move around a little bit. The specific lighting requirements and electrical requirements may change. So there are variable items, right, along with these mandatory fixed items, like the structure of the building and closing it in is probably fixed, but some of the interior fit out stuff would be variable. So we would have the mandatory phase to get the shell completed, and then we'd have this variable phase for fitting out the various floors. And we may price in some stuff that we understand, like if you want hardwood floors on the executive level, here's the cost of hardwood floors. If you change your mind and you want, porcelain tile, here's a price for doing it that way. If you change your mind and want carpet, here's the price for this grade of carpet. We can provide some options, and the client chooses later which ones they want. We've already priced in a certain number of, we'll call them points worth of work, and those points are loosely associated with dollars. So we can come up with a budget for the fit out, and they can choose which items they want as long as it lives within that budget. So that's the idea. The work order model puts aside a budget for interior finishing of the executive suites. We've budgeted in we chose an option. I mean, we gave them a price for carpet and tile and hardwood. We priced in maybe carpet, but we gave them the other prices. And if they choose their mind and decide to switch to hardwood, that's fine. It uses more points. They'll have to shave off points somewhere else. So instead of having a chandelier in the executive washroom, they're going to have to drop that to save some points to help pay for the cost of hardwood being more expensive than carpet. So it's a matter of trade-offs. It's establishing these reasonable budgets of what is an option, maybe a middle of the road option, but give them the cheaper and more expensive options as well. And then as the client goes through, they can make decisions later to choose specific finishes and things like that, fixtures. They can make those decisions and have that budget to play with. But to size the budget, we choose some default options to make sure it's enough. Did that help?
Yeah, we are using that in a certain way. For example, we call them allowances. So we have allowances for kitchen. So we built the kitchen finishes, we allow $300,000, and we allow certain budget for fixtures, for example, and so on. So yeah, we do that.
So this is Agile doesn't take away best practices. I mean, some of these best practices have been around for hundreds of years, I guess, right? All we're doing is we're pulling in the best practices that work with high change environments. And you may have been using some of these practices already in your past, right? And this idea of splitting the contract into these two pieces, the mandatory stuff and the variable, or you called it risky stuff, right? The ability to split it into two has been a practice that's been around. I've traced it back to at least the 1930s, possibly even sooner, that people were doing that. So this has been around a long time.
Yeah. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Any other thoughts, comments, or questions? Either unmute and ask away or type them into the questions window. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a great day. Bye-bye.